Ontological argument. So this is actually a new argument for me personally. I deconverted about a year ago, but I was not at all familiar with the ontological argument for the existence of God. But I've been talking with some of my Christian acquaintances recently, and they introduced it to me as a reason to prove the existence of God. And through the research I've done, I've kind of figured out. It took me a while to actually figure out what the argument was trying to even say. But then I eventually, once I understood what it was trying to say, I was able to see the flaws in the argument somewhat easily. But I think most videos that I've seen explain it in a very complicated manner that I think is unnecessary. So essentially, the ontological argument, what it's doing is it's arguing like, since we have a scale of the quality of things, like I'm stronger than a baby, but there's someone stronger than me, and there's someone stronger than that person, and on and on and on. And eventually, when you get to the strongest possible thing, that would be God. So, like, the highest degree of something is essentially God. Like, there being the possibility of a highest degree proves that God exists. But there's so many. The argument is built on lots and lots and lots of assumptions. Okay. So I'm gonna kind of break it down simply. I have a lot of points written down, which I'll try to get through somewhat quickly. But the first criticism of the ontological argument is just the fact that it tries to prove that God is more than a concept, while using nothing more than concepts to prove this. And it also assumes that it's even possible for these great quality beings to even exist. Like, yes, there is a strongest person. How do we know it's possible for there to be someone even stronger than that? But they just assume that that's God because that's inherent in his nature, is that he's greater than everything else, right? So it's, again, that's an assumption, because how could you possibly know that that's one of the qualities of God? It's just kind of, and it's an idea that you've attached to your idea. And another really obvious thing is when you argue that God is like the greatest of a certain like quality, right? How do you pick which qualities, for example? Because smelliness is also a quality. Some things are more smelly than other things. So you have like a smelliness scale, right? So is God at the peak of this smelliness scale? You know, like, and then they'll say, oh, well, like, we're talking about like God's greatness in terms of like strength, omnipotence, power, knowledge. Okay, but why those attributes and not smelliness? Like, what made you decide that those specific qualities are more characteristic of God rather than other qualities like smelliness, you know? And then they'll also argue, like, for example, they'll criticize the argument of a pizza, like God is like the greatest conceivable pizza, but you could just keep adding pepperonis to it. But then they're ignoring I haven't seen anyone address this, they're ignoring the fact that, like, what makes a good pizza is completely subjective. Like, you can't just continually keep making a pizza better necessarily. It doesn't work like that. Like, you can't just keep adding pepperonis to a pepperoni pizza and make it better and better. That's not how it works. It would taste like shit after a while when there's so many pepperonis on it. And people's taste is completely subjective. Like, people might not even like pizzas, you know? Or some people might like this pizza but not this pizza. So if you're making a really, really good pizza, well, that's completely subjective. You could have one person that really likes it and another person that hates it. So there's no definition for a greatest possible pizza. And the same thing goes for beauty. Like, they might say that God is the most beautiful creature, or God would be like the best music, the best song that could ever exist, right? But that doesn't make sense because those things are completely subjective. There is no such thing as a best song or a perfect song. It doesn't make sense. Like, it's completely contradictory to what art and beauty even are. They're completely subjective. What was considered beautiful 2,000 years ago is no longer what we consider beautiful today. There's different definitions of beauty, you know? It used to be like the architecture we see in Europe, but now We didn't really go after that same type of architecture. Not everyone would find that old type of architecture as beautiful as certain architecture that we have today. And the music that I find to be beautiful is not going to be the same music that someone else finds to be beautiful. You could ask 100 different people what the most beautiful song is, and you could get 100 different answers. You could get a million different answers because there's so many different kinds of music. And you can ask someone the most beautiful color, Well, that's completely subjective. So it doesn't make sense to say God is the most beautiful color, because then you're just like, you can I guess try to make this argument, but then you're just proving your idea of God, your personal idea of God. The best possible conclusion to the ontological argument is proving that the idea of God exists. That's all you're doing, is you're proving the idea of God exists. Okay, now what? Like, there's a lot of ideas, you can have this idea of God, but that just says nothing about whether or not it exists. And they also, again, on the qualities that they attach to this God, how do they know that existence is even a quality of God? And they're assuming that existence is a good thing too. We don't know that. We don't know that God, if there were such a thing, we don't even know if such a thing would exist. We don't know if that would be a good quality or not for him to have. Like, I don't know how they can come up with all of these different qualities for God. And another thing is, like, let's say communication is a scale too. Like, let's say that you have a communicator that's like a 5 out of 10, and then you have a 6 out of 10 communicator. Like, he kind of communicates his ideas clearly, but some not as clear. Then you have like a 9 out of 10, and then you have a 10 out of 10, which would be God, right? The clearest communicator of ideas. Well, that doesn't really make sense, because if God did exist, that would mean that he would be the greatest possible communicator according to the ontological argument. Again, that's a subjective definition in a way, but assuming like the typical definition of communicating, we would expect the God to be communicating with each of his creatures on earth, right? Communicating clearly his existence, even showing himself, but he doesn't do any of that. None of that is happening. Like, there are so many people that will never know even about the idea of God, because maybe they can't read, so they can't read the Bible, and maybe they can read, but for whatever reason, society hasn't spread out to them to even give them a copy of the Bible. So what does that say about God's ability to communicate, And also with the ontological argument, it implies that like this God is bound by the extents of our human thinking. That's such a weak argument for God. Like, you're telling me this God is like only as great as you can imagine him to be? In this ontological argument, God is completely constrained by that which we can imagine. Like, that's kind of a puny God if you're suggesting that, first of all, that you even know what his qualities are, and second of all, that he was even within the realm of your understanding, and you think you can even point to the idea of him. And another argument against this argument, for the ontological argument, is that God had to have been greater than the universe to create the universe. But why do they think this is true? Like, what's the evidence for this argument? Because humans, we can create things that are greater and more capable than we are. We can create computers, microchips, AI, artificial intelligence. We can create all those things that are much greater than any individual human's capabilities. So how do we know there even is a God? What if it's just like a bunch of individual gods that have came together to create the universe, like we come together to create computers, And yeah, I'm looking at some of the more things that I've written down. Another thing is, how do we even know that perfection is possible? Like I already mentioned, we don't even know that such thing is possible. We haven't. How would we even know if perfection is possible? Just because we can conceive of the idea, of something being perfect doesn't necessarily mean that such a thing exists. And the definition of perfection kind of depends on who you ask. What makes one thing perfect would be imperfect to another person. The perfect cup of coffee for one person is going to be the cup of coffee that someone else hates. But I think I've covered most of what I wanted to say. And I think I've pointed out how it's built upon lots and lots of assumptions. I don't know why they would think that imagining something would imply in any way that it exists. I can imagine things that don't exist easily. Like, I can imagine a human in my head that has 10, 20 arms. That doesn't mean that such a thing exists or that it's ever existed. And again, how do we even know that we could even imagine God anyways, if such a thing did exist? Like, we can't even conceive of infinity. We can only conceive of the idea of such a thing, you know? So why would we be able to even conceive of God? It's kind of like an ant trying to understand calculus. And let's say that we did come up with like a definition of perfection. Or if we could prove that it existed. How would we even know that we were right? Because aren't humans like inherently imperfect? So then like our definition of perfection or our evidence of perfection would be based on our own imperfect understanding and our own imperfect human brain. So it would only be perfect by our own definition, which is imperfect. We're not perfect creatures, so how can we even potentially like accurately define something as actually being perfect? So yeah, it's a lot of subjectiveness, a lot of assumptions about the supposed qualities of God, even if a God would even exist. And one thing I heard, I can't remember the video, was saying that, you know, if it's possible for God to exist, then he must exist. But that doesn't make sense to me, because you could also say, oh, well, it's possible that God doesn't exist, so he must not exist. Like, how do you even know that it's possible for God to exist? How do we have any grasp on the realm of possibilities regarding infinite, omnipotent, universe-creating creatures when we've yet to even observe such a thing? It just doesn't make sense to me how you can start putting qualities on this creature and then start defending those qualities, even though you have never even proved that this creature exists. You're already asserting qualities about it. And they'll say, like, you can imagine a God that created the universe, right? Well, what if you can imagine a God that created that God? Well, then they're like, oh, well, by definition, that thing is God. But what if I define the thing that created God as not God? Like, I specifically say, this thing that created God is not God, right? This thing is actually it's a God killer. And the most important part of this thing's definition, we'll call it a floofer. This floofer creates gods, right? But inherent in its definition, and the definition of a floofer, is that it can never be perceived to be God. And no matter what you think about it, you can never think it to be God. And by any definition you come up with, it will not be God. Boom. I just defined something into existence. Like, what I said makes no sense, but it's essentially what creationists, Christians, whatever, it's what they're doing with trying to prove that this God exists through using nothing but ideas or concepts. Like, I can just imagine that there's something greater than your God, but this thing that I'm imagining, I explicitly imagine that this thing is not God. Even as illogical as it sounds, that's part of this idea of the thing, is that it won't be logically comprehensible to you. Boom. Now what? So, it's built on this idea that God would even follow our own laws of logic. Says who? But that was kind of a brief summary of what the ontological argument is and all of the flaws in it. It's pretty easy to poke holes in the argument once you see what it's arguing. But yeah, thanks for watching.